Welcome to the battleground. This video is an analysis of the game that was recorded live, a clash between the Chicago Chess Blitzers and Kentucky. I have posted the link to the video that was recorded live in the description of this video, or you can type the link in your browser you see in front of you and it'll take you to their page. This is the French exchange variation. The French has a reputation for solidity and resilience. Black intends c5 at some point. Usually, the player of the black pieces will try to avoid the French exchange variation, especially in blitz chess. Why? Because, for one, white will almost always exchange on d5, which takes all of the life out of the opening, or as Grandmaster Simon Williams calls it, the groan variation. Psychologically speaking, it is difficult for black to get any winning chance in the French exchange variation. Black simply will be developing soundly and solidly, and he'll get a nice middle game position. But it is very difficult for black to create any imbalance. And if he tries to force an imbalance, he could end up creating weaknesses for himself. And this can make a person feel like learning the deep theory of the French defense of little benefit when compared to the other rich and complex defenses. So, the Chicago Chess Blitzers were the blue team versus Kentucky, the red team, and CCB, having the white pieces, began with e4, and the game continued. e6, d4, d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, and f4. Okay, let's pause for a minute. Starting from move 2 up until now, what is white's plan? On move 2, white had 2 pawns in the center, d and e4, then exchanged pawns on d5, and finally advanced the pawn on f2 to f4. So basically the question is white showing his cards early in the game? To tip one's hand means to reveal one's secret, hidden tensions, or resources. Think about a poker game. Literally, when a player's hand is turned, allowing other players to see what cards one is holding in his hand. Well, in the French, white gets more space in the center and on the king side. Usually, a long-term plan for white is to push f4 to f5 for 2 reasons. 1, either to break apart or hinder black's development on the light squares, or 2, immediately start a kingside attack. Advancing the pawn to f4 prior to developing the knight to f3 first is an ambitious and aggressive line, and although it is not as popular as the mainline Tarrasch variation, it shares many of the same ideas. So f2 to f4 was played early, and the game continued. Knight f6. Now let's go back for a minute. Besides f4, white can also play knight f3 here. But f4 was played, and the game continued. Knight f6, knight f3, and bishop f5. Another popular move is bishop e7. But bishop f5 was played. Bishop d3. A good plan is to capture the bishop on d3 since that is white's good bishop. Queen takes d3, a6. Now, in addition to this modern move, black advances the c-pawn later, making the d-pawn isolated on d5. Similarly as in the Tarrasch variation of the French. And the game continued. Kingside castle, bishop e7, c3, castle, knight b to d2, and knight b to d7. Another line is c5, knight e5, knight c6, knight on d to f3, c takes d4, and c takes d4. And the knight on f6 is ready to hop to e4. And pawn on b recaptures the knight on c6. And black is slightly better here. Slightly. Okay, going back. The move that was played, knight b to d7. And the game continued. Knight e5. Rook e8. And queen to h3. So white is aggressive here. Another move is pawn to g4. But in the game, queen h3 was played. And now, knight f8. Now instead of playing this knight back, black could put up more resistance by playing the queen to c8 instead, with the idea of taking on e5 and trading queens. So after queen c8, the line goes knight on d to f3, knight takes e5, pawn on f takes e5, followed by queen takes queen on h3, g takes h3, and knight to e4. And black is fine here too. Alright, let's go back. So after queen h3 in the game, knight f8 was played, and the game continued. Knight on d to f3, h6. It's understandable that black wants to keep a piece off of g5, such as the knight. But here the move again was queen to c8. And the line goes f5, knight e4, queen h5, knight d6, pawn to g4, and now f6 to kick the knight off e5. But in the game, h6 was played. And now, bishop e3, knight e4, rook on a to e1, and b5 was played. g4, c5. Another move to consider here was pawn to f6, kicking the knight back. And the line goes queen d7, pinning the pawn on g4. And after queen h5, g6, queen h4. Now this may be hard for black to play in blitz. Such a line as this requires home preparation. So g4 was played, c5, g5. Excellent move by white. The move that was played in the game was h takes g5. Another move suggested was queen to c8. And the line goes queen h5, knight d6, g takes h6, g6, queen g4, queen takes g4, knight takes g4, f5, knight on g to e5, c takes d4, bishop takes d4, and knight to e4. And the knight is on an absolute post, meaning that it cannot be kicked by any pawns. Now, although white is better at this point in the game, this was a better line than the moves played in the game. Alright, taking the line back. So after g5, black captured on g5, F takes G5. C takes D4. Again, the move to consider here is Queen C8. C takes D4. Now this was a mistake by white, recapturing the pawn on D4. Take the move back. Now look at the position. Let's examine the board. White missed his chance here to convert this game into a winning endgame immediately. The rook is already on F1, and if the knight on F3 moves, the pawn on F7 will be hit twice. Also, the knight on E5 is hitting on F7, covers G6, and knight F3 goes to D4, takes pawn on D4, then E6 will be covered. Now, white already has the right idea to hinder black's development or access to the light squares. But here, white missed the chance to convert the game early. The move to play here was knight takes F7. And after king takes F7, the line goes knight E5 check. King G8, knight F7. Now, momentarily white threatens checkmate on H8. Knight G6. And after that, knight takes D8. The queen falls. Alright, taking the move back. So, knight takes F7. Now suppose the king plans to take the knight should the queen go to H8, but first tries to take on E3. Pawn takes bishop on E3. Then the line goes knight on 3 to E5. Knight G6, stopping the mate on H8. But white's tactics are not over yet. Knight H6 check, a piece sacrifice. King H7. Knight G8, sacrificing the knight again. King takes G8. Queen E6 check. King H7. Queen takes G6 check. King H8. Queen H5. King G8. And pawn to G6. Now after knight G5, White has knight f7, threatening checkmate again on h8. So knight takes f7, g takes f7, check, forking the rook and the king, and now king f8, pawn promotes to rook on e8. So black here is checked twice. Cannot capture the rook because the queen holds the rook, and the rook on f1 checks the king. So taking the moves back. In the game, white just recaptured on d4. And now bishop b4. Black in this game never played the queen to c8 to offer the trade of queens. Played in the game here was rook e2. Instead of playing the rook to e2, again, the move that white was supposed to play, knight takes f7. And after king takes f7, knight e5 check, king g8, knight f7, knight g6, knight takes d8. Bishop takes e1, queen f5. Rook on a takes d8, queen takes g6, bishop b4, queen f7 check, king h8, queen h5, king g8, and pawn to g6. Knight f6, exchange sacrifice, rook takes f6, g takes f6, and queen h7, king f8, and it's checkmate on f7. Alright, taking the moves back. In the game, white played rook to e2. And now, queen d6. Knight h4 was played. Rook a7. Knight f5. Another move to consider here was pawn to a3. Rook a7. Knight f5. Queen e6. Rook c1. g6. Knight h6 check. King g7. Queen h4. Bishop d6. Knight on h to g4. Another move to consider here, knight on h to g4, bishop takes e5. D takes e, rook d7. Queen h6 check, king g8, knight f6 check, knight takes f6, G takes F6 and Queen G4 check. Rook G2. Queen takes G2. King takes G2. Knight E6. Rook C6. D4. Pawn on D4. Rook takes E6 is a forced mate. But in the game, bishop takes D4 was played. Rook takes D4. Rook takes E6. Rook takes E6, and finally Queen G7 checkmate. Here I'll conclude with my final comments. White ruthlessly went for an immediate kingside assault by playing the pawn to F4, followed by Knight E5. Although he did miss the opportunity to sacrifice on F7, the decision to go for a kingside attack early led to good results. It's understandable why White chose to play the exchange variation of the French by taking on D5, because playing any other variation of the French would have a lot more theory. But choosing this variation with less theory was a good choice for Blitz chess. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for game number 2.